Well, good afternoon to all on this very sort of sunny Sunday afternoon, well, in the southern parts of Europe. And welcome to the session titled The Greener Future for Culture Mobility. My name is Ana Zuvela, and I will be moderating the session this afternoon. The session itself is organized or co-organized with the European Culture Foundation, with Kultura Nova Foundation and MitOst, who are jointly involved in a new mobility project called i-Portunus houses, initiated and co-financed by the European Commission. This project offers a specific mobility support scheme for the local hosts to team up with up to 5 artists and cultural professionals. The main ambition behind this joint venture is to reimagine the future of cultural mobility by focusing on a more conscious, fair, sustainable, and greener ways of traveling and collaborating during and beyond the current global pandemic. The mobility of artists and culture professionals comes across as a rather straightforward, even commonsensical topic, as movement between places and contexts has been an inherent part of the artistic and cultural creativity and activity since centuries ago. In the context of today's celebration of the Europe Day, mobility has been embedded as one of the main principles of the European Union's freedom of movement, goods, capital, services, and persons. However, the topic of mobility is composed of a myriad of intriguing, complex, even controversial political, economic, and social cultural issues, such as inequality, exclusivity, prejudice, unsustainability, environmental responsiveness, solidarity, etc. In recent and present times of ever intensified global movements, the discussion of mobility in the European context encounters grave concerns of migrations and frameworks of mobility regimes involving ethnic boundaries and national borders. At the same time, the discussion on mobility confronts environmental responsiveness and responsibility for counteraction and prevention of catastrophic effects of climate change, which desperately seeks recalibrations of the key functions, meaning, practices, and contestations that define the field of mobility. For today's discussion, and in line with the i-Portunus Houses project, all these angles that I briefly mentioned of mobility will be addressed and explored from a more general, but also from the specific perspective of the arts and culture sector, keeping in mind that the current disrupted mobility for artists and cultural professionals needs new long-term solutions. We are very fortunate to have with us two key thinkers and the most prominent mobility theorists, thinkers, and practitioners, Yasmine Ostendorf and Noel Salazar. Yasmine works encompasses extensive experience in the international arena of culture mobility programs, specifically concentrating on the topics of arts and ecology. Yasmine runs a really interesting sort of alliance called Green Art Lab Alliance, which is a network of 45 cultural organizations in Europe, Latin America, and Asia. And this alliance is in pursuit and dedication towards social and environmental justice. The alliance itself is a result of over a decade of research that Yasmine did across Asia, Latin America, and Europe on artists proposing alternative ways of living and working that shape more sustainable, interconnected, and resilient communities. Recently, Yasmine has been based in Brazil, where she is working on her book Mycelium on Methodology, that looks at the strategies of self-organizing, solidarity, and system design through mycological lens. Noel Salazar is a professor of social and cultural anthropology at the Catholic University Leuven in Belgium. His research work is paved with really significant academic contribution to mobility studies. He is the editor of the Worlds in Motion book series. He co-edited the Pacing Mobilities, Methodologies of Mobility, Keywords for Mobility, Regimes of Mobility, and Tourism Imaginaries, and he co-authored Momentous Mobilities and Envisioning Eden, and numerous peer-reviewed articles and book chapters on mobility and travel. Salazar is the Secretary General of the International Union of Anthropological and Ethnological Sciences. He is a former president of the European Association of Social Anthropologists, and founder of the Anthropology and Mobility Network. Since 2013, Noel has been a member of the Young Academy of Belgium. But now, before I give the screen to Noel, who we're going to start and kick off basically our afternoon's talk, I will just give you a brief outline of the session modus operandi, or the session etiquette. So the duration of the session is 1 hour exactly, which is quite limited time for such like great topic and great speakers. So I will take as least time as possible as a moderator, and we will use the session's time for the individual presentations of our speakers, and then we shall open the communication with our audience for the Q&A. So throughout the session, the audience will be muted, but for your questions, you can write them, and you can write your comments in the Q&A section of this Zoom webinar. So now over to Noel, who will be offering us some critical reflections on border crossing mobilities in general and cultural mobilities in particular, with references to the wider context of COVID-19 pandemic and climate change. Over to you, Noel.
Thank you very much, Anna. I will be showing you some slides also, because we have a very limited amount of time. So here they are, and it looks as if everything is working. So I will try to be relatively brief so that afterwards we have some time for questions, because that may be more important, addressing the particular issues that you want us to tackle. So what I will be doing is taking a step back. I will focus less on cultural mobility than the other speaker. I will sketch more the context in which cultural mobility currently is taking place or not taking place. And so in order to do that, I will develop some ideas, and I will start with bringing us back to mobility as a concept. And so it's very important to understand that when we are talking about mobility, that this is what Henrietta Moore, which is one of my colleagues, anthropologist in the UK, calls a concept metaphor. It's not only a concept, it's a metaphor. And it's a word, that a notion that has been used and is being used by very different stakeholders and actors in very different ways. And you can already immediately understand what I'm talking about if you just think about the contexts where we talk about mobility, and you set that against the context where we talk about migration. So it's very important when we talk about mobility to not just think about movement. Of course, there's movement involved, but it's about movement that is being made meaningful. It's movement that has meaning, and this is coupled to the imaginaries that are attached to it, particularly also before the movement is taking place. So these imaginaries are linked also to expectations about what these movements may bring forth, what they may bring, what they may produce, and they are linked then, of course, to experiences. And these experiences are not only linked to the people that move, all the objects that move, of course, but it's linked to everybody that is somehow involved in those movements. So also the people that are not moving. And so that's what is the translocal linkages are being referred to. Now, what is very interesting is that there's a lot of unquestioned assumptions, or at least I should say before COVID-19, there were a lot of unquestioned assumptions, particularly the first two were before COVID-19 not too often questioned. So the fact that there is mobility and there is increasing mobility, of course, COVID-19 has made us reflect on that, because there is less mobility than used to be the case. And that mobility is self-evident, and so a certain normalization. So it's very normal to be on the move, or at least it was before we entered into this coronavirus pandemic. I think we still, many people still would not question the assumption that mobility generates change, and that we often assume that this, or we expect this change to be positive. And so that's why also mobility as a concept has a very positive ring to it. So it's a very positive term, particularly if you contrast that with concepts like migration, which has a much more negative ring to it. Now, when we talk about mobility, I think it's important to talk also about mobilities, to actually stress that there is not one mobility. Also, if we talk about cultural mobility, I think it's important to reflect on whether we use cultural mobility or mobilities, because there's many different ways to actually be mobile. So that's an important point. And another important point too is that when we talk about mobility, we should also always see it in conjunction with immobility, because it's very often the immobility of certain people and the immobility of certain structures that makes the mobility of certain people and other things such as objects and ideas possible. And so there's always this very close interaction between immobilities and mobilities. Now, and so I'm giving just some general points here to actually frame our reflection on the particularities of cultural mobility. It's very important to realize that when we are talking about mobility, that it's often not happening in a neutral way, but there's a whole ideological meta-narrative behind it. And that's because people who are discursively talking and framing mobility, of course, have agendas. And for example, in Europe, in the European context, it's actually part of the whole European project. The whole European project is based on as much mobility as possible, not just of people, because actually the people came last, but also people. And so it's very important to take this discursive background into account, and then actually combine it also with the embodied practice when we are talking about people, what it is that actually people experience when they are on the move. And so that involves lots of things. When I said that we need to consider mobility and immobility, this is because, of course, there are multiple regimes that actually facilitate the mobility of some, and maybe hinder or make more difficult the mobility of others. And we see that very clearly now during the COVID-19 crisis, that, you know, there's certain people that are still allowed without much problem to travel, whereas others have it much more difficult. And so this points to inequalities, and there are all kinds of inequalities. And so when we are talking in very general terms, it's important to take this, you know, these inequalities into account. And this is also what COVID-19, of course, clearly reveals, that patterns of mobility and immobility change. They react to external factors, to internal factors. And that also means that the imaginaries that we attach to mobility change, although these imaginaries may change slower than actually the realities and the reactions to external factors, such as pandemics. An important point that has been made by a couple of scholars also is that mobility in these days is so important that it has really become a factor that people use to differentiate them and distinguish them from others. And so some people talk about you know, the mobiles and the not mobiles, like you have the people who have internet and don't have internet. So this mobility thing seems to be very important. And this is because it's also linked to kind of, it's taken as a measure of social status. That's why in the literature we talk about mobility capital. And it's very interesting how now in the context of COVID-19 again, there's also all of a sudden talk about immobility capital, the luxury not to have to move and to stay in the safety of your room, house, your studio, whatever, but the choice that you have to decide not to move. And so that's an interesting reflection. And then the last thing is that when we see this in a global context, that of course, there are different cultural meanings, values, and impacts attached to mobility. And so everybody speaks, of course, from his or her own positionalities. Now, coming to cultural mobility, I'm taking here this very straightforward definition. I know that there are much more complex definitions which are more inclusive of other things, but I think for the purposes of what I'm trying to say here, this one works quite well. Mobility in the sense of temporariness. So there's a temporariness, and so that also means that there is an expectation that the person who is engaging in this mobility is or returning back to the place of origin or continuing to yet another place. And so that's what the temporariness is pointed to. And that's also why this type of mobility is seen as positive and why migration is framed as negative. The problem with migration is not that people move. The problem with migration is that people stop moving, or at least that's the discursive perception. And that's why a cultural mobility is good, because people keep on moving. And so, of course, here I think in the discussion we will be focusing most of all on individuals. And so individuals in the cultural context have different reasons to move. And here are a couple of these reasons mentioned. And sometimes, of course, it is also linked to the fact that these people travel with their works, or of course with the performances, of which sometimes they are an integral part. And so these different ways of moving, of course, have different implications, and there's different ways of valuing them. Now, before COVID-19, of course, there were climate change was very high on the agenda. I don't know if you remember the year before 2019, climate change was really high on the agenda. Many people were talking about climate change and linking that also to mobility. So people were already reflecting on that. And then what has happened, I don't need to explain it here. I mean, you have all experienced it in different ways. COVID-19, a certain rupture that is experienced, and different ways of reacting to that rupture. And I think you can distinguish two major reactions. Of course, there's many details or many different ways, but I think there are two major ways of reacting. Certain people who actually hope really that this COVID-19 thing will disappear soon, and who try to stick as much as possible to the business as usual, taking as a model the world and the practices and the way of doing that we knew before COVID-19. So that's one way of reacting. And I've put here quotes, I think, that capture very nicely, I think, the underlying ideas. So the essential does not change. So we need to return as soon as possible to the normal that we knew. And then there's another way of reacting, and this is really taking this crisis, the perception that we are in a crisis, and taking this as a crisis, because in the original Greek meaning, crisis also means a turning point. So it means that it offers us an opportunity to actually change, to make gradual or radical changes. And so instead of returning to this business as usual and the things we knew, is actually using this crisis as a way to think in a more experimental way, explorative way, about other ways to envision this, the post-crisis. And so this is a very different attitude, and it's related to the idea that if we want to survive, if we want cultural mobility to survive, then we need to be flexible and we need to bring in change, because the external context has also changed. And so this is a different attitude. Now, related to that, and we have seen that very clearly, and this has played out differently in different countries, is the question about setting priorities. And of course, nowadays, a lot of priorities have been set on the short term. So there's a lot of short-term priorities that have been set, but this is equally important, of course, if we are considering the long term. I've recently written an article where I reflected on priorities that were being set, particularly at the very beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, in terms of mobilities, where basically a lot of authorities were defining what they considered as essential mobilities. And essential mobilities in this context were framed as what are the movements that are necessary and important for the society to keep on functioning. And so these are, of course, decisions that were made by government and other authorities, and that can be contested. For example, the fact that in most cases the cultural sector was left out. In many places, the cultural sector was not seen as belonging to this essential mobility and not even belonging to the essential professions. So you can clearly see here that this way of government framing is predominantly socioeconomic. And so you see that in quite a number of countries, the cultural sector has been reacting. And so that one of the arguments has been to try to make the argument that culture and also cultural mobilities are actually as essential as these other mobilities that have been chosen by governments. And of course, this is a strategy, but I also want to point out to another strategy. What is very interesting is that irrespective of the choices that the authorities made, what a crisis like COVID-19 clearly reveals is what I have called existential mobilities. And these are the mobilities that people need for their well-being. And so when we talk about well-being, it's in a holistic way. It's an emotional well-being. It's a mental well-being. And so this is very much related to the quality of life and the quality of a good life. And of course, here very clearly you can make the argument that, and this point has been made, that culture plays a crucial role here. Culture plays a very important role to keep people healthy in many different ways. And so this is another way of actually framing the importance of culture and of cultural mobilities. And these mobilities here are taken in the physical sense, but can also be taken in the symbolical sense. And this is why I've included also this nice Japanese illustration related to that. Now, time is almost up, so I want to end here. This is a last slide where I want to not offer answers, because I'm not a future guru. I don't have a kind of ball where I can look into and predict the future, but I think I can give direction to the kind of questions that we should be asking ourselves. And of course, when we are talking about cultural mobility, I think it's important to have a very holistic discussion, and that means including different perspectives. So is cultural mobility important? And then, of course, to answer that question, not only from the perspective of artists and culture professionals, but also more broadly, what's the societal importance and impact related to that? Even if we are focusing maybe our discussion here on the people involved in cultural mobility, of course, it's sometimes quite hard to actually have that discussion without considering at the same time the performances that are involved and also the work, the cultural work that is being produced, and that sometimes, of course, also moves. And then the question, is cultural mobility essential? Is it existential? Of course, we could make a very easy argument that it is both. But what kind of fights, what kind of battles are we heading up? Are we contesting the categories made by governments, or are we actually framing it in different ways? And this is, of course, related to what we want to achieve. Another important question is cultural mobility as instrumental. Is it instrumental? Of course it is instrumental, because it helps artists to further their work and to enlarge their audience and their reach. Are there also intrinsic elements that are important to this cultural mobility? And if there are, what are these? And then inequalities, it was already mentioned in the introduction, and I mentioned it too. We cannot have this discussion without addressing also inequalities that are involved in cultural mobility and that are involved in larger patterns of mobility, where cultural mobility is only one one of the aspects. And then if we agree that cultural mobility is important and it has a place in the future, then of course, a very important one related to climate change is then the question of how should we do this? And this is related to then issues of travel mode, frequency. Should it be less frequent than it was the case? And then of course, the issue of sustainability. And sustainability, not only the ecological sustainability, but also the social and also, of course, the economic sustainability behind it. And I think I've been sticking pretty much to the time that I was given. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Noel. Do we hear each other? Yes, brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Noel, for such a rich and insightful presentation and for deciphering mobility in different ways of interpreting the term as a concept, as a metaphor, and as a practice, but also for situating these different interpretations in context of climate change, COVID-19 pandemic, and most importantly, in culture sector. Also, thank you for raising very important questions of assessing essential versus existential mobility for the arts and culture sector. And is it instrumental or intrinsic in the sense of its traits for the arts and culture sector? But now, and I'm sure that this is going to probe a lot of questions for our audiences and their reactions, given that this duality of instrumental versus intrinsic is something that is like a decade-long discussion within the arts and culture sector. But going back to practices of intrinsic versus instrumental, essential versus existential, we shall possibly find the best answers and the best presentations on that topic from Yasmine, who will share with us her views on how mobility is connected to different artistic practices and how our environmental issues linked to social justice and access, particularly in relation to mobility, while looking at the possible models for the future, starting off from the infrastructure of artist residencies. And I do have to make a small note that mobility-wise, and this is, I think, a matter of existential mobility, that Yasmine is stranded in Sao Paulo at the hotel airport. So please bear with us and be with Yasmine should we have any sort of type of small technical glitches in her presentation. Thank you very much. Yasmine, the screen is yours.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me as a speaker. And yes, it's quite ironic speaking about mobility whilst being stranded, which also explains my rather uninspiring background, I would say. Yeah, I'm really honored to speak anyway. So yeah, my approach, I guess, will be a little bit different. I'll speak a little bit about the Green Art Lab Alliance, which is an alliance of 45 art organizations, including a lot of residency programs across 3 continents and 38 countries that have gathered to exchange knowledge on environmental issues and issues around sustainability. A lot of them also residency programs, so mobility obviously plays a central role. So just a little bit of background on that to give a bit of context. So what we do is we have various different resources that we share, including mappings and publications, and we gather in working groups. We have this thing called a Future Materials Bank, which is an online inventory of degradable or non-toxic or otherwise sustainable materials for artists. So we gather in various different ways. And one of the things that kind of was an exercise in finding our common grounds was the writing of our manifesto, which you will also find online. And it included our endeavors as a sector, as a culture sector, towards sustainability. So you can imagine that like a lot of the important topics were regarding energy and water and waste and obviously mobility. So interestingly enough, the issue of mobility was a point that kind of catalyzed most debates in terms of finding common grounds. So a lot of the partners are residency programs, I said, so mobility is at the core of their work, and more than that, it's a condition for their work, it's their livelihood. Well, it's for others, mobility signified pretty much the big environmental enemy, not flying is next to eating meat or not having children, kind of the low-hanging fruit in regards to reducing your environmental footprint. So I'm generalizing a little bit here, but for the European partners, the discourse about mobility was a lot about carbon. So tools for reducing the carbon footprint were data, policy, science, innovation, technology, while as some other partners, mostly located outside of Europe, complemented that conversation about mobility with kind of different approaches. So talking about, how, for instance, it was much safer for women to fly than to take 40-hour, bus rides, or others were located on islands, or others addressed visa issues. So I think writing that manifesto made really clear that environmental issues, and particularly in relation to mobility, are indeed inextricably linked to social justice and access. So to some extent, I think you can say that environmentalism without social justice is reinforcing colonial frameworks, or as Chico Mendes, I'm in Brazil, so I should reference Chico Mendes. He said, environmentalism without class struggle is just gardening, which I think is quite a powerful quote. So I think for us Europeans, it's Europe day to day, that means also acknowledging the role in colonialism, not only in creating, but also maintaining some of these social inequalities. The legacy of colonialism is ongoing, visible in global trade. For instance, the extraction of resources in and outside of Europe. Here in Brazil, the monocultures for soy or coffee, it's mostly for European markets. It's Europe selling the agrotoxics here to Brazil that are poisoning the water. It's European and American pension funds buying land outside of Europe for monocultures, etc. So these things, I think, are all interconnected. So even when talking about a European context, what we are doing today, we can't limit that to our borders, and we need to acknowledge our geopolitical ties and unequal power structures that are largely responsible for that climate crisis. So reducing our carbon footprint isn't going to suffice. I think we need a deep cultural, spiritual transformation, and this is actually where the art comes in. Creativity remains, the most uncontrollable of human forces, and therefore an excellent domain for knowledge and skill production in increasingly precarious times. This is where we can learn how to be creative, learn about innovative solutions. In the arts, we can use our imagination, we can learn new skills, we can improvise, we can tell a story. And I think all these things are crucial survival skills for this increasingly insecure future. Also, culture embraces the idea of situated knowledge. So embedded knowledge that is affected by history, language, and the values of the person knowing it. In that sense, conversations about carbon have to be complemented with conversations about ancestrality, indigenous knowledge, land rights, food security, ecocide, so in relation to law, and even language, because this is the prism through which we see the world. So I believe that we need the cultural sector to tickle, our imagination and stretch these ideas of what is possible. Also in the arts, we can borrow from different disciplines, from science. We need, I think, this interdisciplinary approach. So whilst reducing carbon footprints, we need to be increasing what I call kindness footprints. So bring to the earth what she's missing: care, love, compassion, listening, honesty, vulnerability, and color, including of our skins. That includes a process of unlearning, whilst maintaining creativity as our main currency. So one of the questions that I was asked to address is mobility necessary for art and culture? My background is in the world of residencies, and as I just kind of demonstrated, I'm a nomad myself, so I was always going to say yes to this question. That said, I don't believe in the hypermobility of the pre-pandemic times, like hopping from biennials to residencies. And I think it's much more about rethinking the time frame of residencies. So not thinking per se of the time of the production of an artwork, but taking, for instance, the time of a seed to grow. I think it's really interesting to start practicing biomimicry, so taking the pace of nature as our standard. This is also what I'm writing about at the moment in a publication that I'm making called Mycelium as Methodology, which is looking at underground networks of the fungus in terms of sharing resources. And then knowledge is not flowing in the air. It's connected to an infrastructure of dissemination. And I'm really interested in like the infrastructure of residencies as, you know, kind of being that mycelium of the cultural sector, like an underground, you know, maybe not visible network, but that is very much based on trust and existing relationships that we can, you know, tap into for the future. And I've been reading a lot of Anat Singh and Donna Haraway lately, and they are also writing about refuges. So the refuge as a place where processes, ecological, mental, social, go to regenerate. So in some of their recent work, they write also about a loss of refugia and how kind of the wiping out of these regenerative and diversifying hideaways is happening at the moment. Whilst right now, actually the earth is full of refugees, human and not human, without refuge. You know, we can think of animals after desertifications or clear cutting, but also climate refugees, political refugees, etc. So the future of residencies for me is not so much about the production of an artwork or even as a method of experiencing cultural differences, but much more about representing a crucial infrastructure for knowledge production and dissemination for, I think, an increasingly important sector, culture, in an increasingly unstable world. So the residency is refuge as a place for healing, well-being, climate grief, and regenerations. So yes, there was also plenty of advantage to the immobility for the arts and cultural sector. A lot of the things that we spoke about, I think, in that time were about having a break, you know, having time for reflection, learning a new skill, time to write your book, whatever. But I believe it was also reinforcing privilege. You know, who can stop working? Who can stay home? Who can afford to lose that income? So one of the final questions that I was asked are, what are the main challenges ahead? So will arts and culture sector will understand the wake-up call of this pandemic? I mean, I hope so. I think one of the things is really being aware and understanding how species, including humans, finding each other for this more interconnected and collaborative survival.
Have we lost Yasmine for a moment? Is she coming back onto us? Right. Until we wait for Yasmine to finish her presentation, that is packed really with interesting points on empathy and well-being and trust, and these key terms basically that paved the way on modernity project, creating the contemporary cultural policies that we know today and that have shaped the main directions of culture mobility that we are discussing today. I would like to go back just briefly to Noel's presentation until we wait for Yasmine, and ask you everything that you basically showed us, and with your experience in the theoretical considerations and research on the study of mobility. Going back to the last point that Yasmine made about the future and about the future prospects and the lessons learned from the artistic and cultural sector, what do you think what does the study of mobility teach us in this very moment of time? Or how does the study of mobility help us to articulate the lessons that have been learned in the crises that have happened before this crisis? It's not the first one, it's not going to be the last one, that's for sure. And what has it taught us about making perspectives for the future forms of mobility in culture?
That's a lot of questions in one. What I liked a lot in Yasmine's presentation, I wrote it down, and I would certainly agree with it. Not just talking about cultural mobilities, but also seeing art as part of the solution more widely. And of course, I would totally agree with that. And I've myself been involved in a lot of very interesting partnerships between arts and sciences, and I think these partnerships should only increase, because art is just another way of looking critically at issues. Exactly the same thing like science, but it's using a different language, and it's using a language sometimes that can reach easier to the wider public than the scientist can. So I think this is definitely this is an important one. Then of course we need to be seeing things into perspective when we are looking at cultural mobilities in terms of what share does that take in the global scale. You know, what kind of percentage is taken up globally by cultural mobility? Then of course this is very minor. This is very minor compared to all kind of other people engaging in mobility. So if this sector and this sector, of course, because it is consisting of a lot of people who are reflexive and they want to change and make their own mobilities more sustainable. But I think that Yasmine's point is a very important one: art as part of the solution more widely, because of course, even if the artist and even if the cultural mobility itself would be more sustainable and more eco, okay, that's very nice, but I think we need to use that momentum to actually work towards how can we make mobility and how can we make border crossing movements as a whole more sustainable. And I think artists have a crucial role to also play in helping us to figure that out.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And thank you, Yasmine, you're back. Over to you.
I'm back. It's a miracle. Sorry about that. No, and I think actually what Noel was just saying was pretty much also what was going to be, you know, my conclusion, saying that the conversation about mobility, we can't simplify it by just speaking too much about carbon, which happens a lot in a cultural context, but really, you know, complementing that with the creativity that we have within our sector, which is, you know, stretching our imaginations of what kind of different systems are possible, and yeah, all the skills that are part of the arts, which include improvising and remaking and I'm super excited about that. And then that combined with this idea of biomimicry that I'm really interested in, you know, this looking at natural processes and mimicking natural processes is a super fertile ground for learning and for solutions, I think, which is a lot about you know, our pace, about time. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Yasmine, and thank you for coming back to us. Before I now address some of the Q&A, if we have any in the chat, when you said, Yasmine, if I can pose a question now about biomimicry and learning from the nature, how would this sort of reflect towards earlier what Noel said, cross-border or transnational, even transcontinental mobilities that have become norm in the arts and culture sector? If we know that, you know, like now, to be completely banal, that banana cannot sort of grow in the Nordic countries, and certain kind of like natural life cannot be transcontinental or sort of like even border transclimatical, so to speak. So does this sort of, that's extremely sort of interesting point that you're talking about biomimicry, what lessons can we teach from that aspect? Do they sort of even push us towards more hybridity in transcultural mobility and different type of connecting and exchanging for the future?
Yeah, no, I think that really touches on this issue of interconnectedness. You know, what's interesting with the fungus, so there's this incredible book called Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake, which is a lot about this, which I think a lot of people might have read, which shows actually that environmental crises are opportunities for increased interdependency, for increased symbiosis, for increased, you know, mutually beneficial exchange. So I think if we, you know, we saw that on micro scales with neighbors suddenly helping each other for all types of things or whatever. So I think realizing that this interconnectedness goes across borders kind of deletes the idea of focusing on this single issue environmentalism, whether the single issue environmentalism is about using plastic straws or about carbon emissions. You know, it's a much more holistic approach to sustainability or to ecological transition or whatever you want to call it, than we are allowing ourselves for at the moment. And I think in the arts, it's you know, amazing to also make this interconnectedness visible, because it's a place of making invisible things visible, amongst other things. So I would say the interconnectedness and the mutual beneficial exchange and the symbiosis is key to that.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Noel, do you have any comments to Yasmine's thesis on interconnectedness?
Unfortunately, I totally agree. So it's and it's very interesting that she brings up the work of Ana Zuvela, who has also been working a lot on mushrooms and how mushrooms travel around the world. And there's a lot of recent scholarship that is trying, and it's a difficult one, that is trying to point at this interconnectedness and trying to also read and understand how non-human entities communicate and how they are an integral part of our environment and our being. And we have, of course, tried to separate and put everything in boxes and categories, but particularly when we are addressing a crisis, we realize how much everything is interconnected, even if we have tried to, you know, and in an analytical way to separate everything. And so it's I think this holistic thing is very important, but it's also very difficult. Holistic approaches are the solution, but that means that it's complex and it requires expertise from many different sectors, including arts, including sciences, and including many other actors too.
Now, when you talk about different sectors and responses that are coming from bottom up, and as both of you have said, numerous answers are there in a sort of biological world, but also in the different languages and grammars and practices of the art. But how do you see that this is this bottom up, so to speak, or like grassroots, or like micro farming of new practices and new forms of interconnectedness? How do you see this being translated in sort of policy prerogatives for the future? Because the mobility that we face now is also a consequence of a long-term policies that have basically sustained, fostered, and supported the mobility, and along with its issues that we are dealing with now. So how do we respond to holistic, so as I said, farming seeds or seeds of solutions with new sort of policy directions?
I would love to answer this question.
Go.
May I?
I would love to hear the answer. Go.
No, because I think this is such a key thing, you know, where policy comes in and where policy really needs to be more brave in terms of meaning, funding, and supporting much more experimental, you know, initiative, much more radical initiatives, going beyond the usual suspects. And the main thing, not only taking into account like what we can quantify in numbers, namely our carbon emissions and our audience numbers, because I think a lot of policy is obsessed with, you know, this quantifiability and therefore looking at carbon emissions and audience numbers. So I think we need to go well beyond that, which means creating safety nets and opportunities for activists, artists, pioneers, but also refugees, change makers, indigenous leaders, whatnot, to realize that they might look like different battles, but they're actually the same battle. And we need to be uniting the people from these different battles, from these different places, recognizing that these histories, but also the present, and therefore that future, you know, is entangled. So it's more about, you know, building this movement that integrates these potential emancipatory currents that are now, you know, dispersed and scattered.
Yeah, if I may add just briefly to that, of course, the tricky thing with policy is that policy is made by politicians, and politicians are very easily influenced, and so that's why you have all the lobby groups around them. You know, it's and so we need to resort to other tactics. And I live here in Brussels. Brussels is one of these hubs where you have a lot of lobby groups. But what we have seen during COVID-19 is very interesting, how actually in terms of, and this is related to local mobility, you have, you know, there's a whole problem with infrastructure, biking infrastructure and walking infrastructure. And then all of a sudden you had with COVID-19, all these people on the streets and not having infrastructure, and policymakers being very slow. And then you see you had all this bottom-up initiatives and a lot of guerrilla tactics, you know, where people would just paint, you know, infrastructure, create infrastructure themselves. And it's very interesting to see how these bottom-up initiatives have now been taken over by the government, and how the government itself is now experimenting with this guerrilla tactics. And so this proves the point that, you know, if there is a lot of bottom-up initiatives and there's a lot of sound and we make a lot of fuss about it, you know, that these little seeds can very quickly grow. And particularly times of crisis are the moment to be experimenting and to be trying out new things. So this is really the moment that we should be doing this.
Hear, hear. Yeah, and actually one more thing to add to that, and I know that's not about Europe, but it's you know, within this Brazil context, in this country that's totally collapsing and you know, has been rehearsing the apocalypse for many times, it seems, is actually that it also created a lot of super interesting movements of, you know, the movement of the landless farmers, the MST. And there are across the world so many interesting movements of people, you know, having organized themselves, creating indeed this infrastructure, decentralized infrastructures of disseminating knowledge and strategies and tools. And so there's so many of these bottom-up movements that I think we can learn a lot from, and that we should be looking at a lot more in terms of strategies and tools and self-organizing, solidarity, etc. Particularly in the world of farmers and peasants, I find.
Well, thank you, Yasmine. I think it's really interesting, and it's so comforting, actually, and optimistic that amidst the crisis, we actually hear and become aware of this a whole mesh of small dots around the globe that can tomorrow, basically like pixels, create a completely different pictures and different dimensions of what we understand as interconnectedness. That doesn't necessarily have to be labeled with mobility as such. So we are into our last minutes. I will just quickly ask you for your last opinions of key words on how we see the cultural mobility of the future. And then I will bid you goodbye and thank you so much for this afternoon's conversation. So let's hear the key words for the future cultural mobility.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm so sorry for this spotty connection. I would say interconnectedness. I would say precarity, unfortunately. I would say uniting battles. And symbiosis.
Thank you, Yasmine. Noel?
Okay, I was trying hard and I was writing down. Yasmine wants to make sure that I have different ones, so that we have a nice set of keywords. I would add uncertainty, but uncertainty not necessarily as a negative thing, but as a factor that we play with and we kind of appropriate. And so that's linked to flexibility, and it's also linked to hybridity. So coming up with hybrid solutions, which we see now in actually many instances where we're trying to combine different things, and it's a good approach.
Thank you very much. So it's interconnectedness, precarity, united battle, symbiosis, uncertainty, flexibility, and hybridity. And I find it absolutely amazing that if we had these words about 15 years ago, they would sound so much more dooming than they do now, where they sound really sort of experimental and really positive and really like stepping into more inclusive and more sort of comforting or wrapping future. Thank you very much. I am, as a culture policy analyst, I personally thank you for the ideas of brave, more radical, more experimental policies that will go beyond just profiling and counting and measuring, and will give into sort of more holistic approaches and more intrinsic, humane and biologically attuned and like harmonized with a human and biological nature for the future. So thank you very much. Have a brilliant rest of the sunny Sunday. Happy Mother's Day to all, also to all the mothers in the audience. And hopefully, Yasmine, you get to where you are going from Sao Paulo. And Noel, have a great day in Brussels. Thank you very much to all. Good afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.